to get you together for conversations, and realizing that it's likely that a lot of you haven't yet seen each other's work. We will sort of start out with like general introductions to your projects. But before we do that, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the concept for these conversations. Like I've been thinking about the conversation from yesterday, which was grounded in epistolary forms, because we wanted to look at how a lot of you all have been approaching mixing the verbal and denotative with the visual and connotative. And that's a thread that I think we can follow into this conversation today as well. The title of which, Nurseries of Democracy, was inspired by the recent US Supreme Court case. I don't know if you all noticed it in the news at all, but there was a teenager named Brandy Levy who got suspended from her JV cheerleading squad for posting some obscenities on Snapchat after she did not make the varsity squad. So let's see, it was fuck school, fuck softball, fuck cheer, fuck everything, along with a picture of herself flipping off the camera. So I've been thinking of that as like an interesting example of the mix of the denotative and verbal with the visual and connotative. And wondering if, that this case would have made it to the Supreme Court if she hadn't like harnessed the power of that combination of word and image. So yeah, in producing her particular epistolary form, she broke the cheerleading squad's code of conduct, which apparently bars critique. And in writing the opinion for the majority, Justice Stephen Breyer called schools nurseries of democracy, since they're supposed to prepare students for, a democratic life after school. And, it helps us, I think about sort of the right to unpopular expression. And he wrote, putting aside the vulgar language, the listener could hear criticism of the team's coaches, and the school. In a word or two, criticism of the rules of a community. So this idea, questioning the rules of a community, is sort of, I think, a nice way to bring us into your projects that we're so lucky to have in the festival this year. And criticism may be an important part of a lot of them, but a lot of them are also just really significant in their look at like organizing new rules for a community or witnessing how communities are functioning. And so I think maybe we'll start off our sort of individual introductions with you, Paul, because I feel like critique of an academic system really reminds me of your project very specifically. So if you can just say, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that's in the festival.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having us and for everybody being here and for selecting the film. My film is called Who Built the Cage? It's a fairly short, fairly simple, I think, little look at the Central Library at Columbia University, which is where I attended as a graduate student, that has the particularity of being a library in which there are no books. And so my project kind of interrogates a little bit about what that means symbolically for what a university is and for who's really at the center of it. And I don't want to explain the entire thing because I hope you'll actually watch it. But yeah, that's sort of the point of departure and trying to explore some of the frustrations and the absurdities on kind of every side of the equation.
You can just pass it to Emmett, and then maybe we'll just go this way around, and then around the virtual folks. Go for it, Emmett.
My film is called Changes in the Ocean, Changes in the Sea, and it's a portrait documentary about a Los Angeles street musician who lives out of his car and frequents farmers markets, and it's kind of a staple of the LA community in that way. A lot of people know him, but kind of looking at that isn't the whole story, obviously, and that he actually has spent his whole life trying to pursue a different artistic expression, which was writing, and kind of about false narratives and expanding the truth and that type of stuff.
My name's Malia Brooker. My film is called Batay, which means workers' struggle in Haitian Creole. And it's about a workers' rights organization that's been working with the textile workers, factory workers in the cities and peasants in the countryside to, in the immediate kind of improve working conditions and wages, but in the kind of larger scale, they are a movement that is, throughout Haiti to improve the lives of all poor people and really change the system. So they're a, fierce anti-imperialist group that is, bringing workers together in solidarity. So we made the film, many people in the US and other places, Europe, most of the world kind of thinks of Haiti as this destitute, like very impoverished, where we see it as these are, Haiti is rich until it became dominated by the US and other Western forces. And they are a really inspiring group that can show us how to organize in the US and other places. So that's Batay. I hope you all will come see it.
Hi, my name is Zelin. My film is Pharmacosis. It's not strictly speaking a documentary, but has a documentary aspect that is critical to the piece, and it takes place in a museum and uses the museum, examines the museum as a site of social dynamics that are governed by a set of permissions that are not easily understood or readily available. That's all.
I'm Adler Shannon. My film was Up the Mountain, and it was about a small Nepalese community center here in Colorado. And it's mostly just looking at this fairly small immigrant community that is, all the way around the world from where they're originally from, and kind of examining how they build their own sense of community in this and how it interacts with the wider community around it. And there's a lot of good food involved as well, so check it out.
Hi, my name is Sean Hanley, and my film is called The Whelming Sea, and it looks at a spawning and migration event on the beaches of Brooklyn, New York, that happens every May and June. So it's a migration event of shorebirds from the southern tip of South America all the way to the Arctic Circle, with a stopover on the Atlantic seaboard, and then a simultaneous spawn of horseshoe crabs. And so the film is kind of looking at the beaches as like a site of entanglement or multi-species assemblages between humans, horseshoe crabs, and shorebirds. And I guess that's all I'll say.
Hi, my name is Devin Allen, and my film is Encounters in Light. It's a documentary that was sort of born out of my own search for a film community in my hometown, and upon doing so, I met experimental filmmaker Lauren Stroden and poet Joanna McClure. So I was lucky enough to have them collaborate with me on a piece that incorporates Joanna's poetry and Lawrence's films, and kind of looks at them in their practice as it is right now, and sort of tries to see how it's changed over time and how their work like interacts with each other, even though it hasn't directly interacted before.
Thank you. Let's go to the folks virtually. Maybe we'll start with Marcy.
Hi, everybody. My film is called Contraction Expansion, and it is about, it's an experimental documentary, I guess, and it's about gestation and its aftermath, kind of from the point of view of new conversations, or not old conversations that have reemerged about family abolition. And it's put together from bits of texts. So that includes science fiction, novels, radical political texts, fragments of songs, allusions to other films, and all kind of made within my family home during what was in the UK the longest lockdown in the world. So it's about expanding beyond the walls of the nuclear family home and hopefully opening up possibilities for things like thinking about gestation beyond gender and families beyond the nuclear family. It's very short.
Thank you, Marcy. I also just want to add that it's probably the most brand new piece in this festival.
Oh yeah, it's the premiere. Thanks so much for having it.
Thank you for premiering it with us. Really excited to watch it with people. Let's see. How about Jean-Claire and Manuel, who are co-directors?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jean-Claire D from the Philippines, and I'm one of the directors of the film, the documentary film, A House in Pieces. The film is about how people try to reclaim their lives in the aftermath of the war between ISIS-affiliated Maute group and the government of the Philippines military. So Manuel, can you add more?
If I can find the unmute button. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having us. This is our first showing in the US, and looking at your Instagram and so on, it would be great to be there physically, but at least we're with you now. Yeah, I think we'll talk more about the film later, but basically one thing that kind of, I guess, could connect to this conversation is this question of recognition and witnessing and memorialization, because basically we started shooting the film with a family in a city when the city already didn't exist anymore, and trying to find forms and words and images and songs that somehow transport this feeling of a place that has been lost. Yeah, and then I think we'll talk more.
Thank you. And then tell us about your project.
Hi. If you don't mind, before I talk about my project, I want to talk about the space I'm in briefly. This is the Filmmakers Co-op office. We're the oldest, well, we're a distributor, exhibitor of experimental underground avant-garde film. And working behind me is Julia Kerr, who's the development director. So I'm actually at work in a community place. And speaking of lockdown, someone's working remotely on the computers. So my film is called Endless Possibilities, Jack Water and Peter Kramer. I started it in 2016, and it was just going to be a portrait of my friend Jack Waters, who makes films and is a gardener like I am, but it became about the couple. He and his partner have been together 40 years, and the film's about gardening, composting, it's about death, it's about AIDS, actually. And they do dance, music, opera. The film itself was about AIDS, and they're wearing hazmat suits. And right after the film, I finished filming, it became and announced that this virus was around, but and so it became about the virus too. So it's actually about the void, it's about renewal. And the structure of the film is based on an African god of storytelling called a Nancy. And a Nancy is like a spider that weaves a web, and the Nancy is non-gendered. It's all genders and all stories and multiple ways of storytelling. And it is a documentary. I consider it a love story, although it didn't get in any love festivals. So I'm thrilled to be in this festival. Thank you so much. And to meet all of you.
Thank you. We're thrilled to show your film. So I guess just maybe a general question that you all could answer in turn, if you feel that it's relevant, would just be like how you, in approaching your projects or in working on your projects, like how you maybe thought consciously about like images and world making or society building, and also like about your engagement with the communities that you're looking at or working with. I'm like really interested in how collaboration maybe played a role in a lot of your projects, either as collaborative directors or collaborating with your protagonists, or yeah, just sort of how you feel maybe like as an individual working within a community and collaborating with other folks. And we can go in this direction, I guess.
Hello. Right. My film does, like I mentioned, it came from my search for community. So specifically, it was, I met Lawrence and Joanna at a film club I joined sort of spontaneously, and because I really wanted that in my life at the time, and I joined in. It was really more of casual kind of get together, like eating snacks and watching sort of whatever they wanted in the evenings at a given house. And over time, as I got to know Lawrence and Joanna, and the film sort of came from that, because I was trying to figure out like where I would go next with my own filmmaking and the kind of films I wanted to make. So it was really great to meet a poet and an experimental filmmaker whose work I really enjoyed, and that really kind of sparked something in me to make really anything, and it happened to be this film, and it's been very influential for me moving forward since then.
Thanks. So I approached this film from a lens of like critical animal studies or multi-species ethnography, and in that way, you know, I'm working with both humans and non-humans, and you know, sometimes both categories were either were willing or unwilling to participate in the project. And so I was trying to approach it in a very specific way, and to kind of get, you know, to access the community of biologists that I had to work with. You know, I was honest about the way I wanted to make the film, and I think they were concerned in ways in which, you know, there's questions of, you know, the representation of their data and their work that I was also dealing with. But then when it comes to shorebirds and horseshoe crabs, I approached it in a way in which I was reading a lot of work by scholars and within multi-species ethnography, and also kind of like and like folks like Donna Haraway were really influential in the way in which the way in which you kind of enter like a non-human world and kind of both think about yourself as a filmmaker, as a participant in that relationship, and there was this terrific. I kind of found this terrific source by a sociologist named Lisa Jean Moore, who actually, she wrote a book about the exact beach I was working on, and she was working as a sociologist studying the research being done on horseshoe crabs in New York City, and I owe a lot to her. And she participates in the film, and through a conversation that we recorded. And one thing when I was thinking about this conversation in advance, I just wanted to like pull out a little bit of a quote that might generate some more discussion too. And it's from Donna Haraway, and she's kind of thinking about the fact that, when I was reading the description, it's just like, how we're making our worlds, how we're making community. And, she likes to say that, we should remember that world is also a verb. And so worlds are not containers, they're patterings, risky co-makings, and speculative fabulations. And so that active presence, both from the creatures in the film and the role of the filmmaker, I think are essential to that process and the decision making that went into how I would approach a particular scene from the point of view of the camera, because I think there's a long history of the way in which nature documentaries are made, the way in which we as humans kind of separate ourselves from the natural world through this idea of the camera. And so the goal was to try to kind of bridge that divide and kind of put the camera in places that you might not expect, and might create a subjectivity of the camera that allowed for some other form of empathy or radical empathy that for non-humans that might be kind of unique to this specific site, but also unexpected compared to the way that we traditionally think about filming the natural world or approaching non-human subjects. So yeah, world as a verb, I guess, is what I was trying to throw out there.
I just want to respond really briefly to that, because the term speculative fabulations, I had to glance over at Lauritz, because that has been thrown around quite a bit in the programming team while we were talking about your film and looking at your film and thinking about ways to program it with other works. So I'm really glad that you brought that quote out. Adler?
Thing about my film, I think the collaboration with those I was filming was basically absolutely necessary, because being in their space, it's not only a community center, but a very active and very popular restaurant. And so I was, right up next to them in their workspace, getting in their way a lot at the beginning. And it was not a community that I was necessarily very familiar with to begin with. So I think especially at first off camera, it was very important to just get to know them as people, so that they would be, more willing and able to better explain to me, their different cultural, the different aspects of their culture that they're trying to bring with them and build it, their own little sort of community. So I think that getting to know them as people was very vital, and later on very much contributed to my film and being able to understand those aspects of community. But yeah, I just think it was vital to get to know them as people first, and then delve into the culture that they're trying to present.
So my film is less about community building. It's really more about community unbuilding. And I approached it through the act of looking. Because so much, we experience the world through looking, and we build a sense of kinship or a sense of belonging through the act of looking. And it takes place in a museum that is a temple of looking. But it's also very much part of our culture today is the act of curation, right? When you choose things for your Instagram feed, or you reject more than you choose, right? When you're curating a film festival, you reject more than you choose. So the negative aspect is as critical, even not even more so than the positive aspect. So I was interested in examining what gets left out, right? What's necessarily left out, and where does it go, right? In this act of curating your everyday identity, of curating your bubble of desired images, right? You want these images to be part of your world. You send them to other people. You show them to other people. And where do all the ones that you don't want go?
I really want to see your film. Sounds great. Yeah, I think this question is one of the most important questions for my film as an American making images in Haiti. Of course, knowing that we are up against most of our audience perhaps having only seen images that are about the destitution and the poverty and the kind of narrative of Haiti as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So going in knowing that we're up against all of that, and how do we tell this story that is about that, yes, but also about the ways that these incredible people there are and have been working in ways that are so integral to how we can think about solidarity and organizing everywhere. And that it is a beautiful country. So our way of approaching that really is mostly collaborating, completely with the organization. The producer, Sarah Cruz, who's in the audience, had been going to Haiti since 2012, doing solidarity work with that organization. So we made the film starting in 2018 with 6 years of that relationship. And then when we were there, we just they guided us. We really filmed almost everything we filmed was at what they wanted us to see and how they saw it. With then intense discussions about, how do we, it's very obvious, it's easy to go to Haiti and show visually how terrible the situation is. But of course, the Haitians on the street are yelling at us, don't film that. We don't want you to take that home and show your American audiences. They're very savvy. They know exactly how the rest of the world sees them. But our collaborators said, you have to show it. We can't talk about about US imperialism if we don't show these, this canal filled with plastic water bottles and Coca-Cola. And, so we looked for signs and images of US imperialism. So bags of rice that say US on them, which isn't going to be obvious to everyone, but that also means behind that US occupation had been part of decimating any ability of Haiti to grow their own rice. And so that we have flooded their markets with our products. So we're looking for images like that are representing the root causes while also showing, where they're at today. And then these beautiful images of the banana fields and the mountains. And so it was a very complex endeavor that we couldn't have done without Sarah's deep relationship and our collaboration, ongoing collaboration with them in the creative process. They also co-wrote and performed voiceover, and so yeah.
Yeah, something you just said, it was somehow connected to the questions that I had to ask myself in my film, which is, how do you film something that's sort of so universal or so ubiquitous that it's essentially invisible? How do you actually find a way to communicate to people that I'm filming these bags of rice that are everywhere, that look completely normal and look completely familiar, but that they're representing this thing underneath? And in my particular project, I'm looking at all of these sort of very abstract things, all of these, structures inside of the university. I mean, all of them. It's a triangle, so it's not so complicated. But I can't film any of them. I'm not even Frederick Wiseman being able to sit inside of a boardroom meeting and actually see all of this stuff happening. So that was a really hard artistic question for me to try to figure out. And in parallel with that, my film really forced me to deal with this question of closeness versus critique. Because before making the project, I had been a student at Columbia, and I'd been a bit of an annoyance to a lot of people in the institution. I'd been helping grad students organize. There's a kerfuffle in our film department that I was in some small way responsible for helping to amplify. So I was already coming from this perspective of, in this very specific situation, being very close to a lot of the issues at hand, and close to the people who were involved, or very close to a lot of the people who were involved. And my question that I had to think about when I was actually trying to put the film together was a question of sort of, how do I free myself from that to actually make, from that perspective, from that activism, that direct sort of goal-oriented line, to make something that to me feels more, I guess, maybe a little bit more universal. That's a dangerous word. But let's say that goes beyond my anecdote, or that goes beyond the anecdote of whatever we were working on. And to do that, I think I needed to be able to critique everything, including myself, including people who were on all the different sides of these sorts of dynamics. And to do that, I needed distance. And so the way I ultimately kind of resolved it in this project was to try to introduce an other, to try to introduce a voice from outside of all of the context that did not exist in the work that was sort of informing my desire to make the project, but that, helped me to imagine how to create a space for the tensions to exist inside the film, rather than just a compression that forces all of them to kind of lead towards a desired conclusion or a specific condemnation or answer. So that's how those were very core to my work.
For me, it was a little easy because the subject matter was a single person. So it was just a lot of time talking to Roger beforehand. The name of this guy is Roger. And we had a lot of discussions about, Roger's a Black man, and we had a lot of discussions about what it means for me to be a white guy filming him. We talked about the history of music documentaries and those types of things, and I expressed that I wanted to play with that and explore it, in the tradition, but also maybe kind of commenting and subverting filmmakers like Les Blank and John Cohen and stuff like that, which he was really into and open to. And then we We kind of developed it from there. And a lot of it was just Roger coming over and talking for 2 hours or 3 hours on my couch. And I eventually, after a few days, started recording audio. And then I set up a camera and started recording him every once in a while and said, look, I'm not going to record the whole time visually. We're just going to do this. And then he was very adamant about it not being, like him not being involved in the editing or saying it. He was like, this is your project, take it, do it, do what you want. And so I kind of took that to heart as far as not being sure if what Roger was telling me was true or not all the time. There's a lot I left out, including like war correspondence stories and like just all kinds of crazy stuff that was. Roger told me the first time I met him that he smokes $1,500 worth of marijuana a month. And so I thought, you know, as far as images are concerned, both in that tradition that I was talking about, but also wanting to play with what is real here. So we shot on 16 and I optically printed a bunch of it multiple times to kind of get removal, and then eventually did some digital editing and stuff as well. But kind of have this sense of not being sure if you're looking at the original source image or not. So, yeah.
Okay, let's talk to the virtual folks. Maybe we'll go in the reverse order. So Jean-Claire D. and Manuel, do you want to start?
Okay. Our experience is very, I think, very layered. Just for context, I come from this part of the Philippines that has experienced protracted conflict between, for lack of a better term, Muslim rebels and the state, the Philippine state, because Muslims are not the dominant group in the Philippines. We're a highly Christianized country. And so when the war happened between the ISIS-affiliated group and the Philippine government in the oldest Islamic city in the Philippines, Marawi, a lot of people were so surprised because they didn't expect that violent extremism was already inside the country. But there were a lot of stereotypes that came out, and usually when conflict happens in this area where I come from, it's always the reportage from international media and national media is always about casualties, just the numbers. And so we thought about, because I founded this initiative to tell restorative narratives. I wanted to look at the refugees themselves and see how people try to restore their lives after the war and how they deal with their being displaced. But then at the same time, I'm not Muslim, so there's another layer of question of representation here, because being the marginalized group, they are often the Maranaos, or even because these are different ethnic groups that happen to be Islamized. They're very wary about people outside, outsiders. I am from the island, but I'm also a settler, and it's also interesting that I'm shooting the film with a white man who's German. So it complicates everything when we go into the community. So I guess I come from the documentary making tradition in the Philippines that's more immersive and more ethnographic. Most of the Filipino female documentary filmmakers usually immerse themselves in the community, stay longer, build relationships, especially with groups that are not disenfranchised. So we were very careful with our our filming, and we made sure we collaborated with our protagonists. There are times then we don't really like shoot, we just talk, and and it's really interesting because the Maranaos are very communal. They are very communal. Their culture is very communal, so they're very, they relate. They're not individualistic, so they relate in a very communal way. So you also have to be part of that as a filmmaker, and recognize that, to be part of that kind of community. But there are also other layers to it because that place is very militarized. So we had to also go through other layers of bureaucracy with the army, and it's interesting because someone mentioned about American intervention. The invisible part of this war is really the American intervention, which is not often talked about. But it's, there's one protagonist in our film, and I'm not going to reveal so much about it, but we were able to interview one of the violent extremists. I don't want to call it terrorist because in my country we just call it violent extremists. And like there are so many layers to like how do we represent this without stereotyping this group of people. If we show him, are we going to, there were questions about when we tried to show it to other people, people in the development industry. They said like it's very, very dangerous to show that face of that protagonist, because it will really validate these stereotypes of Muslims in your country being quote unquote terrorists. And that's part of the war on terror agenda, which is still happening in my country. So I guess like there's so many things that we thought about in terms of collaborating with each other. Me as a Filipino and Manuel as a German, collaborating with the community, us being both outsiders. Maybe Manuel can add to his experience with the community.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm the next layer. So yeah, that of course made it kind of, I guess, like in terms of Claire and me, like naturally had this sort of inside and outside perspective on the place, on the people that we worked with, and I think that also shows in the film. And yeah, the whole world making and relating with the protagonist, it was really a very kind of gradual and also layered process where we more or less started with one family and then gradually expanded our world as filmmakers to their sort of satellites and stories floating that were around them. And in that way, it was like a very kind of open and very incremental process over 2 years, which I thought was fantastic because we didn't really have to drive the narrative in a specific way. And a lot of things kind of that happened earlier on in the project just at some point kept coming back. Like part of the world making of the film for sure is music and singing and songs. And then quite late in the project, we sort of, like, it's almost a forgotten part of Filipino cultural history that this ethnic group, the Maranaos, have been telling their heritage stories through songs since pre-Islamic times, since 600-700 years ago. And at some point, like an excerpt from this chant, the Darangan, then became kind of the opening frame of the film, and also in a way an opening statement about what kind of story or how about the storytelling of the film. So a lot of things, yeah, just kind of came to us very naturally, and I think we could allow them to come naturally because we in some way have been part of the community during the filming. So yeah, that was, I think, part of like a very important part of this experience. And then also that you could grow very close with the protagonist. I mean, we saw their children grow up since the time when they were displaced, and then 2 years later we were still working with them. And I think in that sense, like, because the film really tries to give voice to people that are otherwise not heard, and in that way it kind of made it easier to also float under the sort of the militarized power structures and structures of control that are in place there, because those stories are sort of under the radar. I think that's it from me for now.
Thank you so much. why don't we go to you?
Hi. I really want to see everyone's film now that I'm listening to everyone. It sounds so exciting and interesting. For me, I believe in community. Strongly believe in community, and all my film. I live in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and almost all of my films are about friends, people I know, and artists or fringe artists, underground artists, and that I've grown attached to, that I want to film. And this film, I'm showing endless possibilities, because I don't have, like, I don't even own a digital camera. I know it's hard to believe, but I rent cameras, and I have students. I teach at the New School, and I had a student, Francesco Acosta, and my film has all these different textures, and he had an 8mm camera, and he came and he shot, and it's really beautifully shot, Super 8, and Joel Schlemowitz did 16 black and white, and I felt that this is like a weaving together of tapestry and community. And Jack and Peter's band, their music is throughout. So I also believe, I'm not sure what a documentary is exactly, but for me, what I wanted to strive for was to tell an element of truth, to reach to tell as best I could in a non-linear fashion, because I don't think like linearly, the collaboration, how important it is for community, particularly during COVID. Every morning you talk about nature. I'm a gardener, and I'm responsible in my garden for feeding the cat and the turtles. And so I would get up at 4 a.m. and 5 and walk to the garden and feed the squirrels, the turtles, the cat. And it connected me to the earth. And also, I think one of the better shots of endless possibilities are the worms. Composting, because when I was talking to Jack said, well, death is, it's like fermentation. It's like regeneration, and it's, so it's not the end, it's just a cycle. So the film evolved and grew just like the compost did in the film. Also, I teach at the New School, so during teaching, sometimes I would ask students to help on the project. Devin, who I think is in the audience, actually did sound for some of the interviews with Peter Kramer. So I believe in community working together. I also didn't get, I fund it myself, my projects, because, but I have gotten grants. So funding is an interesting topic to think about. How do you make your film? How can you afford it? But I'm glad, it's a pleasure, and I'm glad to be included in this festival, and that it's part of a community of people striving to make films. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
I got involved listening to everybody else.
No, it's perfect. And then last but not least, Marcy.
Yeah. So my film, I was hoping for it to be more about community than it ended up being. As the genesis of the film, the idea came about in about February of 2020. And when I was conceiving of this film, after I had conceived a child, a second child, I was imagining making a sort of space where I could bring a lot of my friends and community together. And although I've been doing lots of reading and thinking about ways to expand communities of care beyond the nuclear family, and although I think that that is a challenge to actually enact right now under conditions of capitalism, patriarchy and stuff, I thought that we could kind of play act a utopian community of care, which sounds kind of silly, but if you think about kind of anarchist traditions of prefiguration, sometimes you have to fake it till you make it when it comes to building egalitarian or utopian communities, or communities that exist in opposition to capitalist realism. So that was my original idea, and then I ran up into the right after I had that idea, then the global pandemic erupted, and the UK went into a very, very hard lockdown, and people in the UK and in other countries with caring responsibilities immediately all kind of lost their minds, as something I'm sure a lot of people will relate to. And my response to that was still, I mean, I had a bit of a deadline for making this film, which was a baby gonna come out of me. So I made it anyway. And instead of being able to have a community, I was completely cut off from any kind of community of people who could help me deal with this situation of care, of caring for a newborn, of caring for each other. So I reached for ways to imagine my way out of the situation, and that for me is oftentimes science fiction. So I kind of was looking at the bits of text that are in the film, that appear in the film, by Ian M. Banks, going all the way back to kind of the very first science fiction novel, in a way, or first fantasy novel from William Morris, going back to the utopian elements of anarchist and communist theory, and trying to use these as ways of imagining that there could be this different community of care despite the situation that I found myself in. And also I wanted to expand beyond myself and my immediate surroundings by kind of taking stuff from other places. So in addition to the literal reading of text that is in the film, that comes through with little bits of songs in different ways in text, and I use very brief samples and loop them as part of the sound strategy that comes through in trying in a way to use other filmmakers' styles to image my own body and my own home. The idea of distance has been brought up by a couple of the extremely brilliant people who've been talking, and in a way, like looking through the eyes of like 1970s Dutch experimental filmmakers is one of the ways I was thinking, in order to try and imagine a world beyond the world that I was inhabiting and imaging with my camera. So in a way, it's like a desperate cry for community, and for working with communities when I was completely isolated with my kind of family and family unit, which is then punctured briefly by things like my doula. So that in the film, I don't relate my own experiences of gestation or of birth, but these other voices are relating that story. And one of those elements is the reenactment, in a way, of my birth by Kate Ewart, the doula. And there is a voiceover by a very brilliant theorist of family abolition who is also a science fiction writer, Michelle O'Brien, who has some kind of forthcoming short stories coming out that I'm really stoked about. So yeah, trying to have collaborations in this condition where collaborations are actually impossible. I am going to have to disappear for reasons that you can ask Sarah about. But it's been fantastic hearing about everybody's projects, and I'm really excited to use my pass to watch all of them. So with apologies, I'm going to sign out now.
Bye, Marcy.
Bye,
Thank
Marcy.
you.
Thanks, everybody. It's so great to hear about your work.
She actually just gave us a great segue, because I was hoping to sort of talk about like some formal decisions that you all have made, like what she just sort of touched on about like influences of Dutch filmmakers from the 70s. Like, I mean, she's gone now, so I'll just, I guess I won't describe it. I'll just let you guys see her film. But like, I'm really interested in the way Marcy sort of engaged with those techniques to like subvert, or how Marcy engaged with like some of the texts that she used to subvert those techniques that she was also sort of employing in terms of the formal aesthetics. And it makes me think of like, Emmett, what you were talking about as far as like the holes in Roger's story and how you sort of formally represent those with the like choices that you made in terms of like the optical printing and the like, I feel like I watch your film and I can immediately like understand that there is some kind of like question or distrust being expressed visually. Like really, it's really successfully done, I think. So I just kind of want to maybe open a question up just in terms of like how maybe you all thought about like sort of formal or aesthetic choices in order to express the ideas that you were working with or the protagonists that you were trying to reflect on screen. And anyone can answer this if you have a thought to share.
I'll just jump off of this idea of science fiction, because I think that it kind of connects back, at least to the idea of speculative fabulation. One thing that was really inspiring was this documentary about Donna Haraway, where it's called Storytelling for Earthly Survival, where she describes, this concept of speculative fabulation and the idea of the myth and the fable kind of being an entry into different types of world making. And so she kind of says that, SF, the abbreviation SF, can stand for science fact. It can stand for science fiction. It can stand for speculative fabulation. And so they're kind of, there's layers there that, we can play with. And so I took that as a jumping off point to think about the way in which both voiceover in my film is used in a way to be, as myth making, or from like it's where are these voices speaking from? Are they speaking from now? Are they speaking from the future? Are they speaking from the past? And then also in the sound design, science fiction was a big inspiration, because the hope was that, to kind of decenter the human experience, we can like look back at the humans, and particularly the citizen scientists and the researchers and volunteers, and students that kind of go out onto the beaches of Brooklyn at night. There's a built-in science fiction aesthetic because everybody's wearing headlamps. And so there's moments in the film in which, like, I would say that this is like a happy accident where when droplets of water had like hit my camera lens, it creates these kind of orbs of flare around all the heads of the humans. And so there's kind of these silhouettes of humans approaching the camera, and they're just these, it's straight out of like a science fiction world. And so, horseshoe crabs have often been called like alien crabs, and they're, because of their own aesthetic, that can be quite off-putting for people. But the hope was that, like, the question is like, well, who are the aliens in this situation? Like, who is approaching who? And so then my sound designer, Kaya Cirilla, spent a lot of time trying to create, what would humans sound like to horseshoe crabs? Horseshoe crabs don't have ears, but there's research that infers that they can feel sound, or like feel the presence of sound through their carapace, or their exterior, of their body. And so we spent a lot of time trying to think about the way in which the approaching humans would create sounds that they could feel, and then how can that be translated to the audience through this type of subjective sound design and the use of certain frequencies. And I'm excited to see it on a big screen, actually, because this will be the in-person premiere. I've never seen it in a theater, so it's only been on laptop screens at this point. So all the work that Kaya put into the sound design hopefully will come through in the space we have here. So this idea of science fiction can be interpreted many different ways, and I just wanted to kind of throw out some of that inspiration.
I guess that kind of makes me think too about, it is a little bit of a, like a lot of you are working in sort of hybrid modes, right? Like Zealand, you kind of already said, like, well, it's not really a documentary, Pharmacosis. And Paul, maybe, I don't know if you really consider your film to be a hard documentary, but there are like these sort of hybrids happening in approaches that like both incorporating science fiction or incorporating like some staging or some fictional elements across the board. And I think it's really exciting to see projects like those alongside projects that are maybe a little more like conventional in their, made by an anthropologist who's like just engaging in sort of strict visual research, or like alongside a experimental piece like MM's, which is like so intricately layered and like in terms of superimpositions and stuff like that. So if anyone has any ideas about kind of working in a hybrid mode.
I think any representation is inherently positive. It's inevitably positive, right? So it's very difficult to represent in a conventional documentary format anything that has to do with alterity or absence. And so you have to create the conditions that allow those things to emerge. And that requires artifice. And that doesn't, generally that you think of that as being incompatible with documentary, but it's about verite, right? It's about truth telling. But it's impossible to speak truthfully about alterity without, a bit of fabulous thinking, I think.
I was thinking yesterday during the panel discussion about language and how the word can be a negative, and I like what you were saying as fiction almost, or any kind of fiction element being a filmic answer to negative. So like in language, you could say, she didn't go to the supermarket that day, but you can't show that necessarily unless you're creating some kind of artifice or something.
I would say that the scene that Jack Waters and Peter Kramer, when they would, before they would perform with their group of like 14 people, they would lie in a circle and meditate and just hum. And I thought, how do I visualize this? How do you bring it, capture a meditation, a chanting, and give that feeling to someone watching this movie? How do you transform, not make it a document, but actually bring the feeling of these people creating a meditation as a group? And that's where a lot of, I think it was Sarah was mentioning, layering. And that's where I brought in a lot of the layering, is to try to bring that feeling of meditation and transcendence to the spectator. Also, I think that I don't think of it as artifacts. I'm interested in poetry in terms of language, and I like everything from Rimbaud, Patti Smith, and so I do a lot of reading of poetry just to inspire, not to think it in a linear way or a conclusion, because I don't feel there is a conclusion. There's an ending. It's just a recycling, a regeneration. And I think it's interesting. I wish I were there with you in person. I just went to Croatia and was at a film festival that had, and it was amazing just to be with an audience and seeing all these beautiful faces in films.
I wanted to kind of,
Sarah.
It's interesting what you're saying about the fabulous thinking. And in this film, this is my most traditional documentary, I think. And I tried, we had a pretty complex performative scene that we shot where we brought a sewing machine from Miami, and we wanted to make visible the labor that they do, which is mostly sewing t-shirts. And we, it was a very, we had them work with us on creating phrases that were on the t-shirts. And, it was just this very, trying to complicate a little bit what we were doing in terms of representation. And it didn't work, it just didn't. And I think really learning in this process of working with a community whose message is so desperate to get out, it really needs to get out. And that I think working as an outsider with a community like that, just finding the limits of what I could do creatively, what I felt was responsible as a director, what I could, because they really, you have to have them on board with the creative ideas. And so I found, pushing toward traditional documentary, and I still, I consider it an essay film. It's not, totally traditional, but I find that sometimes it's really, hard to get away from these, trying to bring truth in the way that the person who is on camera wants their truth to be shown. So it was just an interesting reflection on what you've put forward.
Yeah. I think we can also relate to this experience, right, Claire? Like, I mean, the film was going to be more conceptual and more stylized and had a kind of a more sort of conceptual layer to it when we started working on it, and over time, and especially in the end, like editing it, we just ended up shedding a lot of this and really bringing it back to the sort of course, everything is a construction and everything has a filter and everything is a frame and a selection, but trying to bring it closer to the truth of our protagonists and not interfering so much or shaping it so much on this formal level. I mean, what we did try was to really focus on the textures visually and also auditory. And I think also one thing that was quite interesting for us in the process was that the one scene that was always clear and that also resonated with something that was also said earlier was the ending, which is this sort of leaving the story unfinished and leaving it in limbo, because that is actually what we felt from the place and our protagonist. So this is like the one scene in the edit that almost didn't change at all.
Yeah, can I add to that? I think Manuel mentioned, at first we really thought of, if you're familiar with the documentary Nostalgia de la Luz, that was our peg. But then later on, we changed, like he mentioned, we changed the film, and it was more observational. At the same time, there were interviews, but I think I just read this journal article about over narrativization of documentary, and I think, like, for me, our film kind of questions that, in a sense, in terms of form. There is always in the documentary industry these days, there's always this need to, like, find a 3-act structure, have a dramatic arc, but, like, from the Eastern perspective, where I come from, storytelling is not like that. It's more episodic, it's more non-linear. So it's quite interesting how, like, we wove our film together in such a way that it's not very clear. The dramatic, that the arc is not very clear in the sense that it follows the 3-act structure.
Yeah, I think your movie pushes back against that in, like, also a really successful and beautiful way. I think we don't have much time left, but I just want to open it up in case anyone has questions out there in the audience, or if you all have any questions for each other before we call it a day. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I'll just repeat. A very wonderful discussion and such stimulating kind of conversation, and kind of grappling with this sense of how do we, as representers, we know that truth-telling is itself an artifice. How do we engage with that in kind of different contexts of reception, and with different kind of consciousnesses that are being kind of, say, worked with and across, say, in different countries, or also different kind of festival arenas. I'm interested in what the filmmakers maybe think about faithfulness and kind of thinking, like, making images that are believable about a certain issue or a certain kind of way of living in a kind of, and say, moving to think about kind of how we kind of believe in others, as opposed to whether they are telling the truth. If that makes sense? Because often people make things up that are actually quite profound. So, like, I'm curious about people, especially in relation to, like, fabulation and stuff like that. So just curious to hear people think about that kind of, yeah.
Does anyone want to answer?
It's a hard one to answer directly, I think. To me, I think this question of, like, faithfulness, which also has behind it all of these questions of ethics or respect to the subject, respect to representation, to the context where it's being, all these sorts of things, that this baggage that comes along with that. So one thing where I think I can speak for everybody is that everybody thinks it's very complicated and very messy. And my own choice, and I honestly don't know how much of this would appear in the work that I have here, because I've thought a lot about these things in the 2 years since I made it. But my sort of ideal for myself is to embrace that messiness as much as possible, and to find ways through it that are creating some sort of like internal connections or internal meaning and internal dialectics between these tensions that exist. Because I think as soon as we settle on like one fixed point of departure from which we're going to try to answer all of these sorts of questions, we're getting we're setting ourselves up for that moment when the context isn't right, or when the reception isn't right, or when there's not it encounters the other. When the film encounters the other that does not match whatever point of departure, and there's always an other from any point of departure. So yeah, I think it's a very conceptual question, but that can only be answered for me in really specific, individual, case-by-case ways. So that's my response to the like meta question, I guess. But Mary, you're muted.
I just wanted to say that I did a film called Chop Off. And when I met it's about body modification. And my friend Clayton Patterson introduced me to him, and I grabbed his hand and I realized he was missing fingers, and I got dizzy. I thought I'm going to pass out on this man. But the more I talked to him, the more engaging he was, the more interesting he was. And he said, why don't you do a film about me? And when I decided to do that film, I was going to be, it's not like if he's telling the truth or not telling the truth. I was going to reflect what he feels his creative practice is, and not pass judgment on it. And it was, it's one of the most intense films I ever shot. And he was the most interesting storyteller. But he's also takes his creative practice to the very edge. And I've had people say to me after they look at the film, I think you're crazy, me. And I said, no, I think that creative practice, like what's it mean to be an artist, is not, I think he's as much an artist as Marina Abramovich. But I hope you edit this panel. But Chop Off, just performance art of amputation, is his creative practice. So I did a film about it. And it was not whether he's telling the truth, but it's his interpretation of what creativity, what an artist is. And every time I shot him, I was on the camera person. I had to find a camera person, Ann Hanneman, that would not pass, that was able to tolerate. And I didn't have him do body modification, but just listening to him tell that story was so intense. That, but it's not like truth, not truth. It's like it's like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari without the ending, which is one of my favorite films about crazy, or not crazy, or storytelling. Very good question, I think.
So I wanted to also answer that question. I think Encounters in Light was like my first sort of foray into anything like resembling documentary, and I was also working with people I wasn't particularly close to. I was trying to develop a relationship with them, and they're both in their 90s as well. So there's a lot of like lived experience I'm working with that I couldn't possibly fit into the project I was trying to make. And so I tried to, what I ended up learning and what sort of became the struggle for me was had to do with a lot of the structuring of the film and how I was to represent like years of practice and kind of honor, try to honor like their own visions of it, because like Lawrence didn't like being filmed and had been in documentaries before about him and has sat in front of a camera and doesn't like how he performs. And Joanna is a poet, but also like doesn't consider herself a poet. And whereas like Lawrence, he has been making experimental works for, decades, and that's very much like part of his identity. And so there's a lot of contrast there. And then there's me who's trying to develop an experimental practice and incorporate that into the film. And sort of became this sort of messy thing for myself. Because just another thing I'd want to add to is like learning like Joanna, whose poetry very much is in line with like beat poetry, which was in itself experimental. She wasn't that much of a fan of like experimental work, and Lawrence, when he would film, he had filmed like their vacations and things and would show that to her, and he had his own treatment of it, and she would tell me how she would like, one of them made her cry because it was like, why couldn't you just film this in a way that represented like how I saw this, or how, why does it have to look so strange, pretty much. And so I kind of had all that in mind. And while I think my film has a clear, like I see it having a clear structure, there's also all that sort of tension I'm working with, trying to represent these people and balance my own urges with theirs.
So I think the truth is a narrative that we construct always, and because it's constructed, it always has a conservative element to it, because it's constructed from things we already know. And so this is always a challenge for artists who are doing avant-garde work, right? Because you're trying to put forth new ideas, right? And the new ideas they will never ring as true. So this idea of truth for me is always something that's a little bit behind. Well, you think of the 20-year gap of history, right? What they call the 20-year gap. People don't think of history until it's been written, and that generally takes about 20 years for it to filter through academia and filter through into public consciousness. So in this sense, an audience is always a problem. And yeah, the audience is always a problem, and it's always a problem of how you lead them through, how you push them through to a new place and to arrive at a new destination, and that's always very difficult. So I think that in a way that a concern about telling the truth, there's always something a little bit reactionary about it.
Thank you all so much. I think that is probably all we have time for. But this has been great. And please check out each other's programs. It's really exciting that there are like multiple types of premieres going on, like for some of you seeing your film on the big screen for the first time, some of you showing a film in the United States for the first time. I'm just really excited to watch all your work together. So thank you again, and that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Talk to you offline, hopefully, at some point. So
Yeah. Email me.
we really are. Thank you.
Stay in touch. Bye. Thank you,
This is
Sarah.
this is the backstage chat.
Thank you.
Ciao.
No, what?